Bam.
I'm Rio Veradonir, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Hey man, thanks for coming on the show. We got Will Reilly down below me here, kicking it. Thanks, Will, as always, for setting this up and coming on the show. We love to touch on challenging social issues because one of the things that Will's good at doing is he's like, "Hey, hold on a second, calm down. Let's look at these numbers and see what the truth is." You know, we get all these challenging things, and for whatever reason, stuff that just to me isn't all that challenging becomes hyper challenging to people. And this week we've seen, surrogacy and going to somebody else and saying, "Hey, we'd like to have a kid," and some other consenting adult saying, "Yeah, rock on, let's do this." But my buddy Mark, his sister carried his baby, for Mark and his wife. Great. Who cares if it's two dudes, two chicks, or whatever? We had three dudes from San Diego who have a family, and they've had a couple different women carry babies for them. They It's a doctor and two other guys. They all make money. Everybody's in love. It's a community. With modern families, what's the diff, right? But people lose their shit over all this stuff. Whether you adopting kids from other places, I don't know, man. So I guess Rio, I'll just jump us off right there since it's topical. What are your thoughts on surrogacy? I mean, maybe you hate it. Maybe you'd be like, Pete, you're an asshole, right? But I don't know. I just, if there's love involved and kids are taken care of, what are your thoughts?
I've seen that topic came up again on Twitter recently. It comes and goes. I look forward to talking to you and Will about where some of the animosity toward surrogacy is coming from. In my opinion, it seems to be coming from both like a traditional Christian nationalist perspective, which I use that term to distinguish it from people who just happen to be Christian, but who don't think that they should force their personal interpretation of Christianity on the entire nation. Some people like that. They're few and far between, but they're really noisy on Twitter. And then there are some people on the far left, especially radical feminists in the Marxist tradition, tend to be very hostile to it. Of course, they don't like people getting paid money to do anything. Everything is exploitative under capitalism, according to those people. So I guess surrogacy is no exception for them. But it's funny you should ask because my wife and I, we didn't use a surrogate, but we did both just go through in vitro fertilization for our first kid.
How dare you?
Yes, exactly. I'm sure that violates somebody's moral code. Will likes to say made up rules. So we did that, and she's a month pregnant with our will be our first daughter now. Thanks. And per the multiple parents thing, our other partners are going to be parents as well, legally. We even hired a lawyer in San Francisco to drop a series of contracts for us. We signed a co-parenting agreement saying that we will all be parents of any children born to any of us and all of that. California is a state, it's a little easier to get away with that than some others. We also have property in Hawaii, which is another state that's pretty tolerant of it. So we actually stipulated in the agreement that we all will never take no matter what happens, if we break up or something, none of us will ever try to take the kids out of the states of California or Hawaii, because that could actually jeopardize their one or more parents' legal status, which is an interesting situation. But, that's how same-sex couples used to get married until very recently. Polyamorous people are just sort of doing the same thing. But surrogacy, boy, why does everybody hate it, Wilfred?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's interesting. You guys can hear me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a little bit of an echo. I'm trying to modulate that, but go ahead.
Is there a mute? Whatever. I'm actually just going to get up and turn off a fan in my room for a second. So.
All right. Well, then I'll talk about
All right, I'm back now. I'm in an office that's maybe 15 feet by 12 feet. I had a fan going. But, I think there's a lot that goes into the surrogacy debate. I'm sure some people have principled moral objections to the idea of paying a human for certain services. And again, I'm not the most conventionally moral person in the world. Like you joked, Rio, about my classic line about just sort of these are just really made up rules. I mean, if you look at human anthropology, there are about 12 cultural universals that, not being a clinical psychopath, I actually would not violate, but like raping a tribeswoman, intense abuse of very young children, what are they, incest, cannibalism, this sort of thing. And I think it's fair to describe those as human baselines. But much beyond that, I think people have opinions about a lot of different shit, and I think those vary radically from culture to culture. And this isn't really disputable. I mean, you can look at highly civilized societies, the Romans, the Japanese, the Arabs, and ourselves, and you'll find a completely different moral framework. To describe any of those as right, as much as people complain about relativism, is just childish. So I think there's some people that object to the sale of certain services. I don't understand this. This is what I was leading into. I mean, any objection along those lines would logically seem to have to cover all pornography. At least the feminists are somewhat consistent on this. But military service, I mean, especially if you're a mercenary rather than a national soldier, you're literally risking your life for money. I mean, I've had all kind of crazy jobs. I've had jobs where people paid me to fight, like nightclub bouncing in tough Chicago neighborhoods. I mean, you can be a little human cockfighter. You can work for the UFC, any of those Javelin, any of the MMA associations. So I don't get the argument, but there are people that are simply morally opposed to the sale of what you could call intimate services, and I get that. I think beyond this, though, and I don't want to ramble on for like 5 minutes, as can be my want. But beyond this, I think that what you see is a lot of just prejudice and homophobia, frankly, in this zone. Like the Christian nationalist types that are really raging against surrogacy right now, the focus seems to be almost entirely on gay men. I mean, like Guy Benson, who's a great guy, center right broadcaster, recently had, I think it was like adorable looking twins with his partner. He's obviously a gay guy. And the thread was just full of like the craziest vitriol I've ever seen. Like myself and Dave Rubin, a bunch of other people. It's like, hey, good job, bro. But all these other people were like, you faggots bought a woman's womb. And, I don't really think that this is a group that's really known for a focus on like the equal treatment of women. I think it's something else that's prompting that. And the same thing with the rad films. Rad films are often fun and entertaining and very much like not like they're advertising if you actually date one. But the open philosophy that they pitch is men are responsible for all of society's ills. So the idea there is, why would you give your womb to two upper class men, not two gay men? So I think those two frameworks really explain most of the hostility. You don't really see a lot of people trying to ban women's erotica or ban service and jobs that might involve violence. You see a focus on these outlier issues that tie into pre-existing conflicts we're having. So that's my take.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that it's important to point out too that you're actually dealing with prejudices in both cases there, aren't you? Classism is a prejudice, and while it might be fashionable, classism against so-called elites or affluent people or whatever you want to call them, white-collar professionals, is also bigotry and prejudice. And it's that prejudice sort of defines the far left worldview, doesn't it? I mean, their entire worldview wouldn't exist without said prejudice. It's probably saying something.
Yeah, that's the thing with leftists. Like leftists present themselves as being far more tolerant than, amoral center-right business types and all that. Those people are the devil, religious people, anyone with an income. But in fact, the left-wing frame is extraordinarily intolerant. If you look at any of the major critical theories, I mean, whether you're talking about classic vulgar Marxism, critical race theory, third and fourth wave feminism, so on down the line, because the entire framework is based around the idea that all the problems for your group are caused by your rival group. I mean, this is Ibram Kendi, Judith Butler will just say this openly. Like, if there's a disparity in performance between two groups, it's because Group A is oppressing Group B. So in reality, that leads to widespread hatred of everyone in Group A. And to these insane concluding positions, like, could you ever let a man control your body that way? Like, a lot of radical feminists think heterosexual sex is rape or abuse. Like, I've had this conversation a couple times where we're talking about, like, someone will say something like the degradation of women in porn. I'm not like a huge porn fan, but like obviously erotica should be legal for adults. Like, it's been fucking the case since the Maya Empire, So like, when you talk to these people, the question I usually ask is, what do you mean by degradation? The most common porn categories are things like good blowjob or he goes down on her or threesome, just normal sexual encounters. And what will inevitably emerge is that they think that sex with men is degrading to like an extent where you might get past that with your husband, but like almost anything else is bad. And so if you ask, like, would you oppose virtual reality pornography? Like, there's no chance of trafficking, anything like that. These are just men and women sequentially dominating each other and coming a lot. Like, would you oppose that? Yes, because a woman's body should never be viewed. And it's like, okay, I see what the problem is here. It's like the idea that everyone in category A is bad. And that's a core leftist principle.
Yeah, from my perspective as a center person, centrist, I guess you could call me, is that I mean, I think that prudishness is actually at play there. And I think that there's a lot of prudishness in the Christian nationalist types that we're talking about as well. By the way, to be clear, I don't have a problem with people who just personally find it distasteful and don't want to engage in it or whatever. Obviously, that's their business, just like my life is my business. But I do have taken issue with people using the state's monopoly on violence to force their personal moral views on the rest of us. And there's no easy black and white answer to the question that Wilfred brought up about what constitutes a good real moral code, et cetera, what's a universal value and whatnot. But that's why we have institutions like our republic and liberal democracy in general as ways to hash this stuff out. I do think it's important that we have liberal protections in the Constitution of individual rights against majoritarian rule. You shouldn't be able to put all the Jews in an oven just because 51% of the population decided that was a good idea. Wilfred, I mean, this is your area of expertise. I'd just be curious to hear you speak a little bit more about what you mean by the fact that morality is relative, but that societies, in order for them to I'm not sure I completely agree with this either, but maybe I do when you finish explaining it. But societies, in order for them to function and for civilization to hold itself together, you need to have rules, you need to have systems, you need to have a way for people to feel represented by their government. So how do you feel about people, for example, who would say, and I this is my opinion, I think that Israel is relatively speaking, with all its flaws, a kind of bastion of liberty and civilization and sanity in a region that is mostly run by theocratic dictatorships that don't recognize human rights. And there is definitely a part of me, even though I understand intellectually your argument, which pushes back against the notion that, my preference for treating human beings well and respecting their human rights is just me forcing my Western imperialist values on them. I think that there is something to it. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think when I say that morals aren't ultimately objectively true, that's just a fact. Unless you believe not just in God, but in what's called a personal God, like not just the watchmaker, but someone who's literally old school going to judge you as you walk across the bridge of the separator. And I don't believe in that. I mean, I think that there's a classic test of like, are you a somewhat spiritual human? Which is like, do you walk in the light and believe in the watchmaker? And I listened to that once and I was like, yeah, maybe, probably. But that has nothing to do with the traditional concept of where ultimate morality comes from. I mean, and I'm being a little cliche here, but if you read, say, Dante's Inferno, the traditional Christian and Muslim writers were very much of the opinion that God was going to, or one of the warrior angels, the seraphim, were going to judge you for what you've done in life, good and bad, which is spelled out in a particular book, and you go to a particular level of a place called heaven or hell based on how you perform. Some might view this as a childish take on Christianity or Islam, but this was absolutely the mainstream take through like 1900. I do not believe that this is the case. And with that not being true, it doesn't make any sense to say there's ultimate morality. You can try these debate salon tricks with me or probably with you, Rio, and say something like, well, would you rape and eat a baby? No, because it'd be fucking disgusting. And I have to think about it for 50 years. I wouldn't want to. And there aren't a very large number of psychopathic killers who would want to. So we as a society managed to stumble on without raping and eating all the babies. But are you going to go to hell even for that? No. So that's what I mean, because there's no such place as hell, to clarify. So that's what I mean by morality is not ultimate, it's not objective. So there are levels to this. Like at one level, nothing you do is going to send you to the 13th circle of Abaddon to be judged by a group of angels known as the Zafar. That's not what happens. At a secondary level, most things aren't part of those 12 baselines. You don't steal from your intimate family that all humans do share. Those rules, I think, in general, we should recognize. Like when you talk about natural law, like some of the stuff Hamas did, like gang raping people during a ceasefire, actually falls in that like almost no honorable human would do this level. So, I mean, I think that there's no ultimate. There are a set of baseline rules most humans share, and much beyond that. And I'm going to stick with this phrasing: we just make shit up. Major rules, the drug laws, the speed limits, the takes on sex work, the white collar criminal laws. You can go on and on and on. 90% of my law books are literally just crap that we made up. The Arabs made up different crap, and it works just as well. The richest Arab countries are as wealthy as the richest white countries, although they're a little hood rich. I mean, they did have all the world's oil under their sand, but that's beside the point. So, I mean, I think that's a standard kind of, not really relativist, but just factual breakdown of how morals develop. And people from Sam Harris to Peter Singer to Averroes back in the day have discussed this. Now, I think there's a second level, which is there are within a human society logical principles which work better at achieving logical ends than others. And there's nothing wrong with calling those something like good laws and avoiding this whole moral debate totally. Like, for example, I don't debate whether or not we have free will because I think it's obvious we have agency. 37% of human decisions occur at the cerebellum level of the conscious mind. We now know we can scan the brain. So all of this, like, but could there be angels controlling that? Or like, if a being knew all of your genetic and environmental influences, could they predict your behavior? Interestingly enough, that would be my definition of a god, a being that could do that. But that's not really relevant to, do you sit down, look at the menu, and make a conscious-minded decision, which was the old debate. So just as I don't find free will useful, I don't find morality useful for a lot of descriptions of personal honor or legality. I think that the Western conception that, for example, women should have rights works better toward the end game goal of a higher national IQ, income, almost anything else, than the Muslim perspective that they should not. I mean, when you see, Pete once mentioned this to me, we were talking about IQ, like, are there differences between West Africans and North Europeans and the other large kind of civilized human groups? And something that came up was the fact that the Arab countries have an average IQ between like 70 and 90. They're all Caucasian descent countries. They're quite wealthy. How could that be? And I actually looked it up, and the reason was that they don't educate girls. They're starting to now, but they literally don't. I mean, there was a long tradition of women being kind of sheltered in the home, not allowed to drive. And it really impacted who's the mother that's going to be teaching your daughter and your son. Mm-hmm. It impacted the intelligence of the entire country. So we can say that there are logical standards that make sense, and we can say they're human baselines that, an honorable warrior wouldn't violate. We can't say that there are ultimate moral rules. And we also can say, and this is I think an important point, that 90% of moral rules, we can settle on that number, like the stuff I'm thinking of in the ILCS, are just made up bullshit. Like, it doesn't matter whether your top speed limit is the Autobahn level or the US highway level. It doesn't matter whether weed is legal or not. It doesn't matter where you put the cutoff for domestic violence. Are women capable of it, as long as the worst things are punished? So on down the line. We just make that stuff up. And this is my last point. I have a personal problem with people who try to tell me that their preferences reflect objective morality. Because I think objective morality either doesn't exist or barely exists in the first place, right? We're talking about like cannibalism. So when someone says, well, I don't think a feminist should have to give a blowjob or something like that, it's sort of like, well, that's your personal opinion. We're probably not going to date. Cool. Don't. Marry a guy that's kind of submissive, likes going down himself. It's irrelevant to me. It doesn't matter. You can still be a lovely person. But saying this is the rule, and then saying, as both the Christians and the Radfems do, things like, so sodomy should be illegal, that's where you start kind of getting into my bailiwick. Because now you're making up a bullshit moral rule that's going to make myself and most other urban men into technical felons. So a problem has arisen because of your conception that the personal is political. That was a bullshit idea in the 60s when there was genuine oppression, and it's an insane one now.
Yeah, it's going to make most rural men into felons as well. I mean, yeah. Oh, boy. Pete, what do you think about all that?
I was having dinner with a guy named David Livermore the other day in San Diego, and he's a world recognized cultural expert, and we were talking about, when the U.S. goes abroad and we try to impose our norms, our ethics, our morals in other places, and we'll talk about the rule, and I'll talk like I'm a fancy guy, English guy, the rule of law, but Sharia is a rule of law, and the tribal code is a rule of law, and all you got to do is scope back and you realize there's a lot of rule of law out there. And so when I go to the Pashtun lands, and I'm talking to the locals, which is something that I did. If you guys don't know that, you can say, "Hey, tribal elder, when someone gets murdered out here, how do you handle it?" And they go, "Oh, and basically what they say is, we handle it in civil court." And you go, "Well, would you handle it in penal court?" And they go, "No, that's expensive. You have to collect taxes. We don't do that. So we handle all that shit in civil court. And we don't care if it happens in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, because this is the Pashtun land, and we don't care about these things." And so that breaks our Western minds. But here we are trying to impose this different rule of law and assume that that's somehow just going to just transition over. And it doesn't work that way. So to what your guys' points is, that transition is costly. It's expensive. It's a power change, and it's a cultural change. And you don't just get to flip a switch. You don't just get to spend a bunch of money and have that happen. It comes at the cost of great expense, a lot of failure, and it doesn't. Chances are it's not going to work at all, because it's just too big of a thing. But we can't even accept that, because we think that our system is superior. Maybe it is, but that doesn't make it possible in the place that we're trying to make that switch. So this is just a big view of things. But if you scooch down all the way into where the seams are in different societal things, whether it's how do you make kids happen in a family, or how do you take kids that don't have a family and put them into it, like all of a sudden you have all of these colliding moralities and ethos. It gets complicated. And then you think, well, we're a free society. But then you go, are we? Are we allowed to do this? Well, we like diversity. Do we? If it gets uncomfortable for you, So those are my points on what you guys are talking about, because it's not as simple as we want it to be. Those are my points. Whichever one you guys want to comment on that, I'll get out of the way.
Yeah, I think that Wilfred's answer made me realize that he and I are more in agreement than I initially thought. I think that it's very helpful to say that there is no true or universal morality in the sense that you mean it, Wilfred, which is this idea that there is a law that is given to you from on high that is unalterable, that we have no role in creating or reforming or improving, and not only that, but I would go a step further. And there's certain anti-theists have persuaded me that the very notion that this is a desirable thing, or that even if that were true, that would constitute a universal morality, is offensive to me as a human being, because it basically says that what is true and good and moral is that you should be a slave, a subject to this higher power, and it's good or evil simply because the higher power says it. So even if it were true that such a God exists, it would seem to me that maybe the right thing to do would be to revolt against that person, because they would be like a cosmic dictator. I mean, like if you live in North Korea, Christopher Hitchens famously said this: if you live in North Korea, you get, at least you can die, but there's no escaping from the cosmic dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, so
I'd say something. Oh, go ahead, Will.
Oh, I think there are two good. Both of you guys made good points in sequence. So first of all, Pete's point is that different systems are good in the sense of we don't need to define every vocabulary word every time. I mean, in this case, I mean legally, honorably good in the sense of producing positive outcomes. Different things are good in different societies. So right now, for example, at our stage of human civilizational development, communism doesn't work. In fact, I don't think it really ever will, because we decided to make diversity, and this actually has a lot of positive genetic upsides, by the way. We decided to make diversity a key point of large societies. We allowed migration. You can be for or against that. But I mean, in very diverse, large, competitive societies with people like former Black and Irish and so on, warriors in the country, what we find works best is federalism, where different regions can compete in sport, business, so on. So I don't know if we're ever going to get away from highly civilized federalist capitalism to a point where, like, I'm going to look at a Yankee from Vermont as a Black guy in Kentucky and think, hey, I want to give him half my money. But at any rate, whether or not that will ever be the case, right now we're not at a point where we're ready for communism. And this is something that actually Marx, for all his idiocy, said pretty openly. Like, we're going to have to progress through every step of the dialectic, like savagery, feudalism, primitive capitalism, real capitalism. We're not even in late capitalism yet, if you actually read Marx, and then maybe socialism and communism. And that's probably correct to the extent you believe the guy at all. So in our society, just attempting to take, say, 60% of everyone's wealth and redistribute that fairly would lead to a bloody civil war, which would get the socialist butchered. So is socialism good? Well, not at this level of civilizational development. Like the civil war that kills half the population would be bad by any objective standard. So similarly, if you go into Afghanistan, I mean, my focus there would be things like clean water and basic women's rights. But if you go into Afghanistan and you tell these tribal warriors that have been sparring for 1,000 years, worse than the Scots and the Bantu, by the way, most legendary fighting men in the world that aren't Gurkhas, but you tell them, hey, we're all part of one society now. You all have to love each other. You're going to meet in this assembly where no weapons are allowed, and you're going to vote on a stable government. People are just going to start laughing. They would hoot you off the thing stone or whatever they're still using over there. It doesn't make sense at that level of cultural development. So that's one key point. Good and bad, and I don't mean to keep saying this like some annoying college kid, but are often relative. You can say within one level of social development, a certain system works better, and you can say it produces outcomes that we want. Something like a decline in rape of women, we'd all agree is good. But at another level, something very different, like a strong king, might work better. So that's one point. The second point also that Rio made is like, I don't think there's anything evil about being flexible, personally honorable, but mildly amoral when you compare that to the traditional religious codes, because we forget how bad a lot of these were. Like right now, we're dealing with such an extreme woke backlash to traditional Western society. We're all going to have to swing from the right for a little bit. But if you actually read through the Bible, I mean, taking biblical prescriptions in terms of what to do with homosexuals or sexually assertive women or businessmen who charge interest. I mean, I'd be hanging from a tree. I mean, like everyone would be shellfish eaters. I'm sorry, Real?
Picking sticks up on Saturday. That's my favorite example. Don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, mine is he who pisseth against the wall. They were living in these filthy kind of pre-Roman cities and like urinators outside and brawlers, or the punishments are things like getting punched in the nuts or having your hand cut off. It's a very primitive cone. So, I mean, to some extent, if that did come from God, an obvious explanation would be that God is bad. In the last sentence from me, but I've freaked out Christians with this sort of Occam's razor approach to the great religious questions like the problem of theodicy. Why does God allow evil? The most logical explanation to that, if you actually read God's word in the Bible or Quran, certainly is one, God doesn't exist, but two, God is bad. I mean, you can come up with all these crazy defenses, like you want to improve our free will by doing, but a much better explanation would be God himself is fairly predatory, image of man, not all that good. So I don't think having objective morals is better than not, really.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Rio.
Are you sure?
I'll just jump in and say this, because I do want to put a stake down on spirituality, because it's easy to take the atheist side and just say the Bible is bad, and we're not saying that necessarily, but we do have to have some spiritual accountability. It's a center of who we are. I'm not saying that you have to abide by all religious rules and everything, but if we don't care for that, if we don't abide by our community and try to be a better version of ourselves to fit within the community by a set of rules and prescriptions, then we can become individualistic, and that's too much diversity. And you have to balance your diversity and your unity and your responsibility. These things do matter. So there has to be something. And if it's not going to be some kind of deity that we all kind of get in alignment with, then it has to be something that God-fearing thing that protects us from the worst of ourselves is important. Don't want to go on the other side of it where it gets bad and nasty, but there is a responsibility there that we have to each other. Otherwise, we go to the other side, and that becomes horrible too. So I just want to put that stake in there that I'm going to get out of your guys' way.
No, that actually set me up really well. I was going to comment on something that Wilfred said, and you already hinted at it. I mean, I'm definitely much more individualist as a person. I suspect the three of us probably are. Maybe not you, Pete. But I also agree that you don't want a society where everybody does whatever they want, anything goes, no holds barred. That would be bad for everybody in practice, except for maybe one or two warlords who managed to rise to the top. So what I think is actually best for most individualists like myself is to live in a society where people are free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness their own way, as long as they stay within well-defined, fair, equally applied, not arbitrarily applied against one group and not against another set of rules that we collectively agree upon. And we try stuff out, and California tries one law and Kentucky tries another law, and we can compare notes and see what does and doesn't work. So I would return to, perhaps because of all of the facts that Wilfred has brought up about the objective morality not having any real evidentiary foundation. If I'm correct, maybe it's not even a good thing, which Wilfred seemed to agree with, even if it were true. So given all of that, and given your point, Pete, about the fact that you have to kind of balance the collective good with individual freedom, it does seem to me like, so far, the best that human beings have managed to come up with is something like what we see in Western civilization today. And I think Wilfred's right that there are other societies that differ from us notably that are also doing well. But and this is really more your area of expertise than mine, Wilfred, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that even the Chinese Communist Party, for example, has largely become more affluent because of the fact that they're really learning from the West. And not that this set of values is a specifically Western thing. It's just an accident of history that it happened to originate here. But when you basically allow the natural competition that's going to happen between people. And Wilfred keeps talking about how, one person wants this, another person wants that. What do you do? Well, one thing you can do is you can use institutions like liberal democracy and capitalism to kind of channel political and economic competition in a way that both respects individual liberty and ensures that the needs of more people are met. And I do think that I don't think that I don't agree with Fukuyama that history is over, obviously, but I do think that we have arrived at the best system so far, and I don't necessarily share your guys' skepticism about whether or not it's possible to spread that to other places. Although I certainly agree with you that you can't just go in and force them to do it, which would be kind of against the point of what I'm saying anyway. Anyway, what do you guys think about that?
I want to jump in on that, Sam, and come back to something that Will mentioned as Will was doing his talk. And this, I'm not challenging Will's greater point, but he talked about fresh water and a recent current event thing that actually David Livermore and I were talking about. And my buddy Scott Richards and I talked about. We both worked, all three of us have worked abroad. And so Mr. Beast went out to Africa and he was invited. And he's like, I went out and I dug a bunch of wells and made this big, glorious video. But if you know better, you know better. You don't get to go out and just dig wells in Africa and think you've changed the world for the better. Otherwise, there would be a bunch of wells with fresh water. One of the problems is once you bring fresh water to a place that doesn't have it, what do you do with the wastewater? Everybody dismisses these challenges and say, but they have fresh water now. It's a horrible problem. Disease, death, destruction, power has been exchanged. All of these things make these things complicated. And so when we go somewhere and try to change a dynamic, it's not as simple as we want it to be ever. And so maybe Mr. Beast did the right thing. Maybe he had experts that helped him do it right. But the thing is if you don't go back and check your work, you have real problems, especially when we bring in social issues that we export our problem. Like we're going to go empower females. Well, we haven't got the first fucking idea how to do that, how to empower an entire group of people, these ladies that we're trying to educate or teach how to weave or whatever it is. You go to a place where they stone people to death for being whores. We don't define what a whore is, they do. That becomes dangerous. So when we take on these things, these ideas, these concepts, there's actual life and death problems that come from that. And so we have to be careful when we have a great idea, because again, that's us being Western and saying, hey, I know the problem for you guys, and we don't get to describe the problem. We have to slow down in these cases and really spend time in that culture and understand where the problem is and let them define it. And if we're not willing to take the time to be an expert, to go slow, to learn, to get things wrong before we ever try to fix something, we can't. And so when we use an example like water, I think it's a great example because it is not easy to bring fresh water. And if bringing fresh water is hard, imagine with something complex like rule of law or religion or whatever else it's going to be is going to be. I'm going to get out of the way.
No, I mean, I think that's essentially correct. I mean, the water example is a good one, but there are a bunch of different things like this. Like, yeah, I mean, well, actually, I have a question about that. Why would bringing fresh, like, what's the problem with bringing fresh water to different societies?
I think that's a question for Pete, maybe.
Yeah, Pete.
Yeah, the freshwater problem, because you don't know the dynamic in that area. So if you go to Africa, even if you get invited by a tribe, what's the tribe next door going to do? Who's going to take care of that fresh water? One of the classic examples is this. So you go to a place like Afghanistan and you say, hey, we're going to come drill this well for you. If the ladies are carrying water for 5 miles, isn't it going to be great that they're downtown? And the ladies are like, hey, motherfucker, that's our free time. That's when we all get to talk and take care of family business without the dudes being on our back. You're putting us on Front Street. We don't mind walking because that's when we take care of shit. That's when we handle all this business and get left alone. You guys just ruined that. And so they won't do it. So there's a passive aggressive rejection of that solution. Another thing is, again, wastewater. So now you have, like, they have a means of gathering water and using water already. You're disrupting an entire system. It may not be the best system, but now you have no way to deal with the wastewater. So now if there's fresh water in the house, now there's wastewater in the house. How do you get it out without causing cholera and any other waterborne and human waste-borne disease? These becomes real problems. So we always love to bring the fresh water and like, hey, they could bring one. Well, what about all of the different ways that there's problems from that? And we don't ever account for that, because we're just there to bring fresh water. We haven't thought through the entire problem. And that's just the water system. That doesn't include the power system and all of the different struggles. Oh, by the way, Village A has water. What about Village F when they come down and be like, hey, man, I hear you got fresh water, and now there's death. And that happens all the time. When somebody gets something and somebody else doesn't have it, when the place where there's never enough, people die.
Yeah, so I actually see, like, Ouroboros is making some of these points in the comments saying, like, if you dig wells, you deplete the water tables, which in Africa tend not to provide a great surplus of potential water in the first place. I mean, a lot of the poorer regions of that continent are near the Sahara Desert. Yeah. No, I mean, but this again, I think gets into the concept of, is there an ultimate, objective, morally best system? And I think that there are some that work very well. I think ours is probably the best I've seen. But the answer across all types of human society at all levels of development is no. There are all kinds of things that we don't even consider. So, like, a friend of mine was an anthropologist who worked in Papua New Guinea. And one of the things they wanted to do was bring modern, Western, high-paying jobs to New Guineans, who it turns out are pretty impressive warriors. And, not that they go to school, aren't doing that badly on the IQ boards. Like, the idea is, well, why not just train them to be bankers or whatever? Like, the whole Bronze Age, Stone Age society, it's over in 50 years. It turned out that's not the case, because there aren't enough jobs for everyone in Papua. So there's a tradition of kind of big man culture in these islands, where if you get a good job, or if you're the chief, jobs are a recent invention, you're expected to provide for all your relatives, who are expected to fight for you at need. So you'll be giving all these big feasts and handing out like yams and small pigs and bushels of bananas and all this stuff. I mean, it's very, horn of plenty. It is a tropical island. Things grow well. And then when there's a clash with the neighbors, 50 or 60 people will show up with, machete swords and back you up. But the problem with the people that got the first wave of Western jobs was that people expected them to be sort of big men. They realized what $28,000 a year would translate to. So all these cousins would start showing up at your house like, when is the feast? We can't wait to support you at the local athletic match, but now do your part. And all these sort of nerdy accountant guys are like, what the hell? What are we supposed to even do about this? Many of them just left their job because it was easier than supporting this mob of violent, like, warrior relatives that suddenly appeared, like, you're Hiawatha or something. So, I mean, like, It's important to understand that. I mean, and this type of culture was actually developed among sophisticated but technologically primitive people like the Khoisan to prevent the rise of chiefs. The idea was that there wasn't enough stuff there, not chiefs, but like kings, whatever. You wanted someone who became a big man, who became wealthy, to be a good war leader, to be respected, but you didn't want him to keep consolidating stuff and building a bigger place to live, and eventually, making you fight for him against tribes far down the river and becoming what we became, like a civilization with all its pluses and minuses. So there's an anthropological reason why this culture exists, but when it exists, it's almost impossible to break. It's actually like the great original rival of our culture, which developed into cities. So, I mean, I thought that was pretty fascinating. The other thing with Pete, that's also very common apparently in political science and in anthropology, where if you give something to one group of people, another group of people will simply take it. This is the thing I don't. So again, like, are there real rules that God signs on? I don't want to keep just saying the same banal, amoral shit, but not really. I mean, so like when people are so outraged that like Vladimir Putin, Venezuela's President Maduro, even you could argue the Israeli generals who are going to totally break Gaza, that they're taking the land of others who could do that. I mean, everyone could do that until 50 years ago. How do you think we got this country? So I mean, none of us, like whites, blacks, Hispanics, none of us are from here. The natives didn't have metal weapons. So the idea that these systems, the rule of conquest, the big man rather than the chiefdom model, last thing for me, but the idea that these systems are just going to go away, or even that they're dramatically inferior to ours, I would have a lot of questions about that. I mean, both of those did pretty well for a really long time.
Yeah, just one thing more thing too, in like Islamic culture, there's a dude whose job is water. He's already got a title. He's like, I'm Jeff the water guy, and you just took that guy out. Guess what? He's going to undermine you, and his religious job is the water dude. So you have to keep track of these things because they matter. Hey, Rio, jump back in.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well, I mean, one thing that jumped out at me from both of the examples that you guys gave, which were great idiosyncratic examples of a bigger issue, which is that, when you kind of hyper focus on solving one problem without taking into account the way that it's going to be implemented into the broader culture, the broader economic system, the broader political system, or whatever, that often leads to really bad problems. My wife and I are also investing in rental properties, and I've been doing all kinds of research. And California is not the worst state to be a landlord, but it's not the best either. And I remember every time rent control comes up for a vote, we happily vote against it. And it's not because the Marxists would say it's because we're evil bourgeois bastards who want to exploit the proletariat. It's because people who advocate rent control are hyper focused on solving a problem in what seems to them like the most direct, simple way possible, but they don't actually take into account what really happens in an actual marketplace when you artificially do something like that. In reality, what happens is older, more established members of the community who are usually better off stay put in artificially low rents, which drive down the supply of housing and therefore increase the cost of housing for younger people who are moving to the community or who are just starting out and who actually can't afford those higher prices. So you have people who can't afford to do so subsidizing people who can. No matter how many times I explain that to people on even the center left, sometimes some people on the center left are actually open to that. I'm going to be more fair. Some are. Now, certainly every time I try to explain that to a hardcore leftist, what will happen is eventually they will say, fine, I get what you're saying, but that's only a problem because we live in a capitalist society and I want capitalism to fail. And so a lot of it comes down to, I'm just going to do what I feel like doing because it makes me feel good. And if it makes people angry, then good. It means that the pitchforks will come sooner rather than later. And that leads us to the too individualist side of things, which is anarchy, or in practice, actually, probably totalitarianism. Because when people feel like far left ideas are being shoved down their throats, rather often they end up electing for right wing authoritarians because at least they'll let you keep your house. And that's an impulse that I have myself sometimes, frankly.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Pete. I didn't know if you wanted me to keep going or if you had something to say now.
No, I think it's great that comment. One of the things too that we experience here in California is we fill up in certain areas, and like my dad lives in Capitola. It's on the edge of California, and there's really nowhere to go. There's not enough fresh water. Santa Cruz is right next door. The the architecture is weird there because it's super old, and so easements often cross over. Like there's roofs that are over the top of each other, and instead of saying, "Hey, UC Santa Cruz is full. Let's build out to east," we go, "No, come on in. We can't build anything higher. You guys just got to jam into smaller and smaller spaces." Man, it doesn't work, right? But there's my brother right there, Dane. Give me a thumbs up. And it's true, right? Like like in Berkeley, like let's build higher, and then you have more and more compacted places, and so the roads get more congested, and the towns get more congested, and the businesses are in instead of just saying, "Hey, let's cap this in this planet, and now let's push out to this area and let's push out to that." We don't, and so we don't account for it, and it does get harder and harder to find rent, and it does get more expensive because there's more and more demand for things, and so it often ruins in areas beauty and everything else that goes into that. So I wanted to definitely mention that because in California it's a very interesting problem where because we can't say no, we we challenge ourselves to plan something in a way that makes any sense. And that has nothing to do with left or right. It has everything to do with how do you organize a living community.
Yeah, I mean, another point there, just very briefly, is that conditions on the ground often determine what the best solution is. I mean, so a big tendency that I see on the left, but I also see on kind of that harder alt right, where people will say things like, "Why don't we just stop diversity?" And it's kind of like, well, I'm not leaving. What the fuck are you talking about? The country's 60% white, it's 40% minority. We have to figure out how to get along. We need more mixed marriages. But I mean, like the idea of the simple solution implies that the simple solution is possible. Like when people say something like build more housing, that implies that there are no zoning laws or no neighboring cities, and that can easily be done. When people say, why don't we just keep the rents low? Well, the reason for that is that people, as Rio said, as anyone who's ever invested in real estate knows, I have myself, I mean, people are then going to stay put in the same mediocre dwelling place for 35 years. No one else can buy in. You're going to get these weird skewed population dynamics, so on down the line. Like your community is going to get a lot worse. Why don't you build housing for poor people? Because then you have housing projects in your community. You can do any of those three things situationally. You can have a rent controlled HOA, or you can build one Section 8 complex or something. But it's like the old Thomas Sowell line, like there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Like you're not going to find that is a perfect answer. And whether it's even a good answer depends on the conditions on the ground, the local laws, the population, the political dynamics, so on down the line. I mean, sounds unrelated initially, but I once would work out in a dojo, and I wasn't even there mostly for the martial arts, but I'd work out in a dojo where the sensei threw all this fucked up shit all over the place, excuse the language, but he'd throw like stumps out on the fighting ground, and we all hated it. And someone asked him about it once, and he was like, well, if you ever get in a violent brawl, much less you join the Marines or something, like where you're fighting is not going to be on like a mat. So, we have these rocks all over the place, these sticks and so on. So you actually learn how to do something. And the rock and stick environment is what real life is most like.
I love it.
Yeah. I want to riff on the only trade-offs thing, because I mean, Soul's right about that. But what that implies too is that you try to find the trade-offs that are worth making, right? I do think that there are mutually beneficial trades to be made, right? I'm sure you would agree with that. And
course, yeah.
Mutually beneficial doesn't have to mean both parties benefit to the same amount. It doesn't have to mean both parties benefit as much as they would have if they had taken a different trade. It just has to mean that they both benefit enough to be worth their time to do it, right? And of course, the more parties that are involved, the more complicated it is. So precisely because society is so complicated, one of the strengths of our Western liberal democratic capitalist system is that it is super flexible. It makes it possible for us to try out different trade-offs. Let's try this. Let's try that. Let's compare how this worked here versus how that worked there. How did it work in San Francisco versus Chicago, et cetera? Is there a reason that it worked better in Chicago? Are people just different there or whatever, right? And the problem with the the simple version of a universal morality, which is quite different from what somebody like Sam Harris, who you referenced, Wilfred, would advocate. And I find his ideas somewhat persuasive. I don't know whether you do or not, but certainly the simplistic idea that you find among religious people or people who believe in ideologies that are basically secular religions like Marxism is that they don't leave any room for flexibility at all. And if you don't have room for flexibility, then all you can do is just keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, which is why we're still debating socialism after it's failed 1,000 times, you know?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting general comment. I mean, so one problem with ultimate or religious style systems is that they don't allow for flexibility and growth. That's actually a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about. And sorry, I actually checked my email for a second, so I was a little distracted. But nonetheless, coming back in with the heat. But yeah, like so that actually is a fascinating idea, though, that the systems that work the best are systems that allow for learning in almost an AI fashion. I mean, so capitalist markets and all that have their flaws. They can be ruthless, brutal if you're at the low end, but the market is capable of learning. Like if you attempt to market a product and you see that people don't want it, we're seeing this now with the extremes of the trans agenda. You just stop doing that and you do something else. If you believe that there is one thing that is ritualistically by definition correct, you can't stop doing that. So if you're an Islamic or a radical Christian society and every woman is sexually dissatisfied and you keep fighting religious wars and average life expectancy is 40, you can't stop the things that are responsible for that. Or at least it's going to take a long time, a reformation in the literal sense. Like you can't stop converting the heathen or following your laws about sexuality. Same thing with Marxism. I mean, like communism doesn't work. It is, I know again, in 2,000 years in the future, it might. Like we're all assimilated into one racial group and machines print out what look like beautiful 24-ounce porterhouses, but are actually made of, pure organic material in the lab and so on. Will we then be comfortable sharing what we have? I don't know. But in the modern era, communism has failed over and over again. Why can't they just stop pursuing this failed system? Because they literally call it a dialectic. It's a religious style model. They must be right. So yeah, that's problematic. Not learning is bad.
Yeah, I think that post scarcity, ironically, if it is brought about, it'll probably be because of the fact that capitalism was so good at trying different things out, mm-hmm. Right? If we get to a post scarcity future, I personally would have absolutely. Why would I begrudge my fellow humans, more stuff as long as it's not being taken from me? I'm fine with that. And I'm not sure it necessarily even makes sense to call a post-scarcity future where ownership matters less because there's just so much abundance. Would that be communism, or would that just be like a capitalist society where I'm thinking about like people I know who are like really rich, like hyper super duper rich, right? They still find stuff to compete over. They just start coveting the things that you can only get one of, right? Like, oh, you only have one Picasso, I have 3 Picassos. You know what I mean? Like, and sure, yeah, AI can 3D print an exact copy of an original Picasso. But only the one that was painted by the master, right? So people will always find things to covet, even in a post-scarcity future. And I think that the ownership of property will still matter, but it won't matter materially as much, which kind of brings me to use a term that Marxists like, right? Material. But even by those standards, though, you said capitalism is brutal at the low end. Deirdre McCloskey wrote many epic books. Soul's done the same. Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now did. I mean, the data is pretty strong that capitalism is actually really good, even for people at the bottom, that the poor have gotten better off as a consequence of capitalism and globalization, by the way, which is the boogeyman of the people on the right who hate capitalism. But that's a pet peeve of mine.
No, that's correct. I mean, I think that modern Western capitalism, democratic capitalism, there are a lot of issues with the Chinese version and so on. But if you're looking at systems that produce like the positive end game goal of highest income and most relative freedom is the most successful system we've seen so far. Now, again, this gets into, are there ultimate dependent variables that everyone shares? Like, I mean, so Islamic states tend to believe that a high level of spiritual faith is one of the most important things a society can produce. And a lot of the Muslim countries tend on average, even with the abuse of women, to be happier than we are. So what does good mean? It really depends what the DV is. It really depends what you're focusing on. But our system works really well in terms of the things that we're focusing on. It certainly outperformed the Muslims and the Africans and so on economically. That's not even close. So yeah, during the era, what you're referring to is that famous graphic, I think, where for all of human history, you look at GDP per capita, it's a flat line. Since we got out of the caves, I mean, like since Rome, the Silk Road, the era where people had clothes, you have pretty much GDP per capita of $900 per head of household. And then you hit the Industrial Revolution and that starts skyrocketing upward. So by 1820, I think it's 1700, 1830, 1840, 1850. And today, I mean, like the average personal income for an English speaking white or black male in the USA, I think is $56,000, something like that. So yeah, the poor in capitalist societies in America or France or Germany would have been the ducal level wealthy almost anywhere for almost all of history. You get to shit indoors. They're talking about sex. They're toys that can enhance that. They're weapons that throw fire half a mile. Like it's unbelievable. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the current system. But the issue is, I think, relative deprivation in our country. That's why you see people from like working middle class black families that have like an old Cadillac in the driveway stealing 3 new Kias. It's not that you have any problems. Just ask your fucking dad to drive you to practice. It's that you want more because you see more around you. And so I don't know if people are happier today than they would be in a peasant village where everyone had, good solid food twice a day and there were no real differences in income. You'd probably see hate then when the Lord rode by on his charger.
Oh, happiness that's just going to have to be a question I'm going to ask you, Will, because I don't know anything about this, and you must have looked at some of the data. And I mean, first of all, how are people defining happiness, and is it all based on self-reporting? I mean, put your most skeptical hat on. How seriously should we take that idea?
I think that the happiness data is probably pretty accurate because it tracks with reality. Now, I think that there's one real caveat here when you look at the happiness and satisfaction data, which is that you can argue it's invalid because the happiest people often have no point of comparison. So, I mean, the most sexually satisfied people by far, in terms of self-reporting, are women in traditional Christian marriages. But if you actually look at this data, and I don't mean to be crude, but like basic questions, like has your partner ever made you have an orgasm with his mouth? It's like 8% yes, and people saying like, I refuse to answer this. Who are you, you dirty science man? And so like, I personally think if you were to take like my partner or yours or Pete's and drop them in one of these marriages, they'd be like, what are you doing? What is this Amish bullshit? Like there would be real critiques of what was going on in the bedroom, in the bank account. Like a lot would be said. But I mean, so those are the happiest people read that metric. I believe that. I mean, it's self-reporting, but they've done brain work at the same time. It's been replicated 50 times. Question is what does that mean more than anything else? But the basic happiness questions, like how often a day do you feel positive, full of light, very content? I mean, they're not bad.
Okay. Well, in that case, I guess I'll just have to. I am certainly not one to argue with data, and I'll take your word for it that you've looked at it. I mean, in that case, I like your example though about what would happen if a woman or a man who is accustomed to good sex was put into one of those happy marriages. Happiness is personal. I like that we've gotten full circle and gone back to the main topic of my magazine, but. Yeah, I mean, happiness is personal, right? And so what makes one person happy won't necessarily make another person happy. And that's really kind of another argument for the Western classically liberal approach to society, isn't it? Let people find happiness on their own terms. Of course, what hardcore collectivists on both the left and the right, who have a very paternalistic, authoritarian bent, what they don't like about that is that they think they know what's better for you than you do for yourself. And also they tend to focus on outcomes rather than, well, to the point where they don't give any value whatsoever to independent autonomy, right? And so those of us who advocate autonomy, in all fairness, what we have to do is we also have to say that comes with a certain degree of responsibility. You don't get to say, I want to live in a free society, but then, I dislike the outcome of the decisions that I made, therefore Uncle Sam needs to bail me out or whatever, right? And so there is a trade-off there as well. But happiness being personal, there is something to be said about self-reportedly more happy. I'm willing to believe you that that's correct, but does that mean that person B is going to be happy? I mean, they might be miserable in that situation, and that should matter in our analysis here.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty obvious point. And I mean, there's almost sort of a high school analogy here. Like, would the majority of people would the majority of people be more happy in a really rah educational environment where people were encouraged to be jocks and cheerleaders? And I mean, I was a varsity athlete in high school, but like all of the classic stuff, like their pep rallies downtown, and the bottom 20% of kids are kind of abused to unify the social order, and no one's openly gay, like the classic 1960s model in white or indeed middle class black schools. Would the majority of people be happier in that system? Yes, actually, according to most of the happiness data. And when you ask people to describe the 1950s and 1960s in the USA, what they'll very often say is there were none of these problems. There was no domestic violence. There weren't all these queers all over the place. You know, you didn't see all this racial fighting. And the reason for that, however, is that there were these systems set up to enforce very immobile community standards. Like, you couldn't openly be gay. I mean, gay sex was illegal in a lot of states. That's why you didn't see gay people. There was like one cruising district every 5 cities. You know, the same thing, the races were kept separated, formally or informally, in the North. Most people, including well-off blacks, had restrictive covenants in their deeds saying you couldn't sell to the enemy. So that's why you didn't see ethnic conflict in your school. You know, the principal cheering on the team had a drinking problem. And so all this sort of stuff. That kept many people pretty content. I don't know if this is the best analogy, but I think it works. But that rested on a very large number of people not being able to express themselves in very fundamental ways. When people are allowed to express themselves, experiment, so on down the line, it probably is true that they are less easily kept content by very simple things. But it's also true that many of the things in society, arts, level of civil rights, level of dating, shopping and consumer culture, those things pretty measurably increase. Like, stacking up American food today against American food in the middle class in the 1960s wouldn't be much of a contest. So, I mean, I favor the autonomous model myself. Now, again, we're getting back to this idea that there are many systems that work. This is another one, like conventionality on an almost military model actually works pretty well, just like the Islamic system, just like the big man pre-civilization system, blah, blah, blah. But again, I guess the one that would be, there are two things. Like, a woman in the Christian marriage may feel she is the happiest, most satisfied woman in the world, but also probably knows less practical stuff about sexuality, pleasure, so on, than most people elsewhere. So which of those is better? I would agree people should have the choice to choose, the choice to pick.
Yeah, I completely agree there. And I also think that freedom of association is an important factor here. If people want to create, you know, a high school that intentionally, artificially creates that 1950s thing, which I don't know to what extent that really existed, or if that's just something that we see exaggerated in movies and Broadway musicals and stuff, then, you know, I think that's great. And heck, I might even choose to send my daughter to that school if such a school is available, because it might be the best one available. I certainly don't want to send them to one where she's going to be indoctrinated in critical pedagogy, a la Paulo Freire or whatever, but you know, I'm also thinking too about something that both you and Pete said, which is that not only is hyper focusing on one issue and failing to look at the big picture going to backfire on you, but also I think that you have to kind of know where you are, right? So at For Majority, we publish an article by a religious, conservative, bisexual man named Ron White, who is he's actually converting to Judaism because his wife is Jewish. But he talks about how there are two different approaches that activists have used to try to get Orthodox Jewish communities to be more accepting of people like him, who's bisexual. And one of them is the kind of far left, I call them practivists, these hardcore people who just go in and say, we're going to sue you, we're going to force your hand. And it turns out even when they win those lawsuits, in practice, it doesn't work. It just pisses everybody off. They figure out ways to get around it. But what does work, and I don't remember the name of it offhand, but there is an example of a good nonprofit, a good LGBT nonprofit that in this article by John Hyde at Queer Majority. But basically, they go in and they talk to people using their own language. They talk to, because it's run by Orthodox Jews for Orthodox Jews. They know the language, and they go in and they speak in to their values. And they work out compromises. So they don't get the extreme version that the activists want, but frankly, that would be crazy anyway. Instead, they actually achieve the goal of really integrating people into that system and reforming it a little bit, making it a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more open-minded and accepting. So I think that going in and working with a culture, whether or not Will's right about moral relativism, and I think in the sense that he means that I agree that he is right, cultural relativism certainly is true. There are different cultures, and it really doesn't make sense to say one culture is better than the other, in broadly speaking. So being able to go into a culture and work with the culture is going to work better for you than working against it, obviously.
That's correct. Oh, I think that's correct.
Do you guys want to say anything in closing? Should we wrap this thing up?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I just talked. Why don't you go first, Will?
Okay, yeah. I mean, so I think we've talked. I don't really have like a written closing statement here or anything, but I mean, I think the conversation is an interesting one in terms of a large number of. I'm kind of rambling here. A large number of themes were covered, and I do think that basic idea of there may not be one ideal way to be as a human, but there are things that work best at any given time. And more importantly, there are things that work best at any given time for different people. So there's a huge argument for Western autonomy to allow people to explore what works best for them. I think I'll leave that as my closing comment. Actually, the high school thing, I think it gets into a real point here. It very often is true that the old ways worked very well. I mean, so like right now, there's a huge online and in real life, I know 8 or 9 of these people, trad wife movement with women that want to leave kind of the poly party scene, only sleep with one guy, run the home as opposed to working as lawyers, or in many of my friends, this sort of thing. People are buying small units of land, which is quite cheap down here in Kentucky, growing their own food, which actually tastes like food, so on down the line. And I actually think that's great. Like all of my friends that are doing that are really happy. Like they're enjoying sex more, they're enjoying work more, they're getting in better shape, carrying around panniers of eggs and all this rustic stuff. I'm not in any kind of Green Acres mood right now myself. But I mean, I think that's wonderful. The thing about it though is that they now have the choice to do that. I mean, prior to modern feminism, for all its many flaws, and even that's what Rich or Bush says. Those aren't old times, the norm simply aren't the same. Yes, that's correct. Like prior to modern feminism, or even to the end of subsistence farming, you didn't have a choice about doing that. That's just what everybody did. Like the job for 80% of males, 90% of females was farm manager. So today we have the option of saying, well, I've made a fair amount of money in the markets or in the law. I want to return to what we used to do, REVTRN or whatever. And I have that right. So similarly, when you said you might want to send your kid to an athletically focused, maybe Christian sort of school, if there was a good prep in your neighborhood, now you can do that. But you could also send them to, a Montessori grade school or something like that. Or you could give them 1 year of critical theory at camp or something. You now have the options available, So I think that is the ideal. You can choose to not be feminist. That's great. In fact, I think most women, about 80% was the example I gave, that were happier under the older model, will probably choose to not be feminist. But if you do happen to be a bisexual girl at a rural high school, you no longer have to be miserable and in hiding for the rest of your life. You can choose to be feminist and move to San Francisco. So I think that combination of the lowest level of law that works to keep civilization going is very easy to advocate for.
Yeah, the lowest level is interesting. Semantically, I'd want to push back on that a little bit, just because it makes it seem like it's weaker in a way. I think I know that's not how you mean it, Wilfred, but yeah, I think having limited government is an absolutely key part of the West, and even like Canada and Western Europe, which we Americans tend to think of as a little bit too collectivist, a little bit too authoritarian, a little bit too lefty, even they are doing better than the rest of the non-liberal Western world, because the truth of the matter is their governments are still quite limited, among other things. You do have to have a balance there, and it is about options. I started out talking about my family. I guess I'll close talking about it because you were just talking about your friends moving. I mean, we just bought a big farmhouse in the country. We're going to settle down and raise our 1 or 2 kids there, definitely at least 1 so far, with multiple parents. And yes, it is bisexual and it is polyamorous. But apart from that, you'd be hard pressed to tell our family apart from your typical upper middle class conservative family. Frankly, I mean, we get our Christmas tree from the local high school band fundraiser, and we support all the local family owned restaurants out here, and we buy our food from local farms. And I mean, we are living that TradCon lifestyle with this one small difference, frankly, and I'm really looking forward to it.
I love it. Well, I appreciate you guys coming on the show. Let me roll these credits and we'll say bye to each other. Hang on one sec.
Sounds good.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.